Hello, welcome to this first session on the nervous system. This is going to be an introductory session which will lead into more detailed topics, hopefully. This is what we aim to do in the first session. Identify the structural features of a typical neuron, identify the three types of neuron, and identify how the nervous system is organised. So it's a nice steady introduction to the topic. So here we have a neuron. You may well have seen it before in the introduction to cell biology unit. If we're going to learn how a nerve works, you've got to be able to identify the structural landmarks on it and the features of it before we can get into the more technical information. And the first thing that we should really realise is a nerve really only works one way. It only sends information one way. It's not a two-way thing. It can only send it one way, and it generally goes in this direction. And I'll start back to front really, because these here on the ends we've come across before in the skeleton and muscle unit, and they are the axon terminals. Remember, a terminal in an airport is the last place you go before you jet off to another country, and that's the same with a signal in a neuron. It's the last place the signal gets to before it leaves the signal. Now I'm going to flip to the other side and tell you about this section here, and that's where the impulse starts. So this whole spiky tree-looking head of it is called the soma, and sometimes called the cell body, but the technical term is the soma. That's the sort of head bit. We've obviously got N for nucleus, which I don't really need to fully label, and these spiky tree looking things are dendrites. Here, all these branches coming off the nerve there. The next label to put on is actually not lined up, and I'm going to put it here. So it's this section here where the soma just about meets this cord bit of the nerve. Now the cord bit, which I'm going to show you in blue, is this bit here, and it goes underneath that barrel looking thing, and there you can see a bit of it there, and it goes underneath the barrel, and so the cord goes really all the way along the length of the neuron. Some of them up to sort of a metre long, really long, and obviously some are very minute. Now the blue cord bit is called the axon. It's like the cabling, the wire of the neuron. Now this black bit that I've shaded in where the axon meets the soma is a special place called the axon hillock. And that will only become live or real to you when you start learning about how a nerve transmits its impulse. But it's important for future videos that you know where that is, the axon hillock, the joint between the soma and the axon. So what we've got here next is these barrel-shaped looking things. This here, this here, this here. It's like the insulation of the wire. Now the whole thing, so if we take the whole lot of barrels, even though there are spaces in between, the whole lot of barrels is called the myelin sheath. The myelin sheath. More specifically, if you looked at one of them, it would be made of Schwann cells, like fatty deposits that insulate. They play a really important role in boosting the speed of a nervous impulse. And again, it'll become apparent to you when you start learning about how a nerve works, because they are, like I said, very vital. And the last but not least section of this nerve is these little gaps here in between the Schwann cells, in between the myelin sheath. You see that there are little gaps, and again, these are really vital when it comes to understanding how a nerve works. They are called something special, the nodes of Ranvier. The nodes of Ranvier, and they also help in boosting the signal or the speed of a nerve. So that's it, they're the landmarks. I would expect you to know where all those are. You can go and have a quiz yourself on the Quizlet if you want to, but try and embed those into your memory. Okay, so now we know the general structure of a generalized neuron. Before I move on, I just want to make you aware that they're not just sort of, if that's the soma and they're the terminals, they're not just structured in that way. So some are structured like this, for example, and have different sides to the terminal, so the signal would sort of split off in two. So it's not just the case that we've learned the generalized one, there are different types of neuron, or different shapes of neuron. But there are generally three types of neurons. So here's a brain or a head, here's an arm, body. What a beautiful drawing. It's a bit like E.T. So let's say there's a bit of fire going on over here. Now the hand is not going to burn themselves. Is that 6 fingers? Definitely is E.T. Right. So if there's a fire here and somebody puts their hand close to it, not burns themselves, but puts themselves close to it, now you know that hand is getting hot. Your body tells you that area of the world is hot. And how do we know that? Well, we have a nerve or nerve fibers that have the soma in your hand. They are detecting temperature, and they're known as receptors, which fire off a message down a sensory nerve. The sensory nerve. So the sensory nerves detect information. They detect information about the world around us, and they pass messages towards the brain. That's what sensory nerves do. We then have, if this is the spinal cord, we then have nerves that carry the message. So the message is passed across to this next nerve, and then it goes up into the brain. And here are the axon terminals in the brain. And we call that a relay neuron. Whenever I say nerve, you should really call it a neuron or neuron. Okay. So that's the relay neuron. And then the brain decides, oh, that's hot. What shall I do? Shall I go closer to the fire because I want to heat up, or should I pull away because it's getting too hot? So the brain sends a message down another nerve called a motor neuron. And motor neurons are generally attached to muscles or effectors that do something. So if that's the muscle there, the bicep, let's say, and this nerve will attach to the muscle and cause it to contract in some way. So if it wants to pull away the hand, it will pull away the hand. So what I'm trying to say there is that there's three types of neurons. There's a sensory neuron, there's a relay neuron, and there's a motor neuron. The sensory neuron goes towards the brain. The relay neuron, like passing the baton in a marathon, not a marathon, a relay race, it passes the message to and from sensory to motor neurons. So if the signal comes to the end of the sensory, it goes to the relay, it passes the message back to a motor to be able to do something, and that's generally how the nervous system works. Now, we already come across lots of sensory neurons and lots of receptors that detect information, like thermoreceptors and baroreceptors and nociceptors for pain, osmoreceptors for water. So there's lots of different neurons and receptors that detect information around the body, and they're constantly feeding the brain with information about the world around us to try and keep us alive. And that is how our nervous system works. So This is just going to set out the sort of branches of the nerves that we have in terms of the organisation of the nervous system, and just probably like to think about the motorway network of the UK. Lots of it stems from London. It goes around in a clockwise fashion, all the motorways, and they're going to different places. And that's really how, I suppose, our nervous system is organised. It's organised into sort of routes and branches. But unlike the motorway system, they have different jobs. So I've put a diagram up here which shows the organisation of the nervous system. So let's take the nervous system first of all. The first split is that it splits into the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. And what that means is that there are nerves that make up this. So the neurons in the brain and the spinal cord make up the central nervous system. The neurons that make up everything else, dangling off it, is part of the peripheral nervous system. So if you see a nerve in the arm, it's part of the peripheral nervous system. If you see a nerve in the brain, it's part of the central nervous system. And we can see that it's separated here. So that's really quite straightforward, this section on the left. It's nerves or neurons within the brain or spinal cord. And that's it. Generally made of relay neurons and motor neurons, but also they can be sensory too, because there's receptors in the brain, etc. So I think I'm right in saying that anyway. The nervous system on this side, on the right hand side over here, is the more interesting, because there are different nerves of the peripheral nervous system that do different things, and we've talked about them already. We've talked about motor nerves and we've talked about sensory nerves. And what happens, the difference between those nerves is that sensory nerves go towards the brain, motor nerves go away from the brain because they're attached to effectors, and generally the brain makes a decision what to do. Sometimes called afferent and efferent nerves as well. Now we can split these motor nerves, so if here's the brain and here's a nerve coming off it to a muscle, we can split these nerves into two types, somatic and autonomous. Autonomous, that's shocking, autonomous, it's like I've never read that word before. So somatic are voluntary nerves. So if you want to contract your muscle right now, if you want to contract your bicep and do a bicep curl, you can do that. You can cause a bicep curl, and that's because you're using a somatic nerve, a motor nerve. So it's a motor nerve that is somatic, and it's part of the peripheral nervous system. Okay. Now, alternatively, we have motor nerves that are autonomous, which means that we don't think about them. They're not conscious and they're involuntary. Involuntary. So, for example, the muscles that are squeezing through the food in your digestive system, you know, these rings of muscle are contracting to squeeze the food through your digestive system. You're not thinking about it. You're not, obviously until the end, but you're not thinking about how that food travels through your digestive system and how the muscles squeeze your food through. That's because it's autonomous. They are involuntary, and the brain does it for you without even thinking, which is pretty amazing in my opinion. Now, of those involuntary muscles, we have sympathetic nerves and we have parasympathetic nerves. Now, both of these types of nerve are autonomous, so they're both involuntary, but one of them is ROD, one of them is FOF. That's what I call them anyway. ROD stands for rest or digest. So in times of calm, in times of peace and quiet, and when you're resting, your parasympathetic nervous system will be lit up. And for example, when you've had a Sunday roast, you've had a fill of a massive meal, you'll feel sleepy. We've probably all felt this when you've had a big meal. You feel a bit sleepy. That's because you're in your parasympathetic system, your parasympathetic nerves are firing off. You've just had a meal. You're safe. You're secure. You can sleep. You can rest, and so your parasympathetic system starts shutting down the emergency systems and starts kicking in the sort of rest and digest systems. That's when your food will be digested. That's when you'll relax and save your energy and conserve your energy. Now, when you, for example, go down a dark alley, I'm not suggesting that you do very regularly, and you see something move, let's say a cat jumps out and something makes a noise, that's when your sympathetic nervous system kicks in. Again, it's involuntary, but you'll feel your heart rate increase. You'll feel an adrenaline rush. You'll feel super hyper energized, and that's when your sympathetic nervous system will kick in. It does it for you. It turns you into fight or flight, which is what FOF stands for, fight or flight. That's when your fight or flight system kicks in, and it'll sort of sharpen your eyesight, sharpen your hearing. It'll basically make you become superhuman because your sympathetic nerves are turning on. And it's often like two dials on a radio. This is the sympathetic and parasympathetic. So you turn one up and you turn one down, and vice versa. If you turn one up, you turn one down. So the sympathetic and parasympathetic nerves firing off all the time. One example would be definitely the heart rate. So if here's a traditional heart diagram. Here's your brain. Now we've kind of learnt about the structure and function of the heart already, but what we have got on there, if you remember, is something called the pacemaker, and that's what decides the rhythm and pace of the heart. We have a parasympathetic nerve attached to the brain, and we have a sympathetic nerve attached to the brain. So if we're in rest or digest and we need to rest and we don't need lots of energy, we don't need to burn lots of energy, then the parasympathetic nerve will fire more often. It'll go doom, 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 doom and tell the pacemaker to slow down. Whereas if we start exercising or we start running away from a dinosaur, the sympathetic nervous system will turn up and the parasympathetic system will turn down. So that will increase heart rate and therefore get more blood around the body, more glucose around the body for energy, and it will allow us to be a fight or flight or have a fight or flight response. And those are that's the organisation of the nervous system. All of the nerves that are in this diagram are structured very similar. They fire one way. They have all the different components we learned about in the last slide. It's just that they have different jobs. And I hope it all makes sense.